What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in this video I'm going to be going through my Week 8 quarterback start sits, talking about every single starting quarterback, listing them as either a start, fringe option, or a sit. Starts are players you feel very confident throwing into your lineup, pretty much like your weekly locks. Fringe options, these are going to be more like your back-end QB1s, your high-end QB2s, and then sits are players that you'd keep on your bench. I feel like 7 weeks into the season, we have a decent idea of what we're kind of dealing with here at the quarterback position, and I think the position as a whole has been a little bit underwhelming. I know, at least personally, I thought the quarterback position was pretty stacked heading into the season. You had a lot of those high upside guys. You had solid, like, mid-tier QB1 options in the middle rounds. And then I thought, like, the depth options, your late round QBs, were stacked. Like, you were choosing between guys like Geno, Daniel Jones, Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins, a lot of quality options, that could have even been like the QB2s on your rosters. And I feel like it just hasn't really panned out that way. So let's just dive right into the first matchup here. Buccaneers taking on the Bills. For the Buccaneers here, Baker's going to be a sit for me. I feel like he's a guy who could be a fringe option in plus matchups, but that's just not really what we have here going up against the Bills. And then obviously for the Bills, you fire up Josh Allen as a high-end QB1, no matter what the matchup's looking like. Then we have the Texans taking on the Panthers, and I feel like CJ Stroud is a solid fringe option at this point. Coming off the bye week, not overly scared of this Panthers defense. I know they're kind of worse against the run than they are against the pass, but I think Stroud will be fine. So I like him as a fringe option, and then definitely going to be sitting Bryce Young. Just doesn't really have the talent around him to kind of be a consistent fantasy play. Then we're going to have the Rams taking on the Cowboys. And for the Rams, Stafford hasn't been great. He just hasn't been able to put up the touchdown numbers. There have been a few guys who just haven't had those passing touchdowns there. Stafford's been one of them. I mean, he's got Puka Nacua. He has Cooper Kupp. I think they're going to come at some point. So right now he's more of a fringe option as like a QB2 play, but I still think he is playable. And then kind of a similar spot for Dak here. Coming off the bye week, had a decent game before the bye. I think he's a decent fringe QB1. Not going to be like a locked in, set it and forget it every week, but I think he's fine if he's in your starting lineup, your QB1 spot. Then in a divisional matchup, we have the Vikings taking on the Packers. We saw Kirk Cousins play exceptionally well against the 49ers, and I think some people may then expect him to be a start. I get the logic, right? He just tore up arguably the best defense in the NFL. I'm not fully convinced that that's just like what he's going to do without Justin Jefferson. We saw him kind of struggle against the Bears. So you had a really bad defense, a really good defense. He kind of like swapped his performances. So I'm not just going to go all in on Kirk Cousins. Not a great matchup here against the Packers. They have been pretty tough against opposing quarterbacks. So I think he's a solid like back-end QB1, but I don't think he's like an auto lock in your fantasy lineup. And then for Jordan Love, even if from like a real life perspective it hasn't been super pretty, he's still giving you decent fantasy production as like a fringe QB1 at this point. And then he also has a decent matchup here going up against the Vikings. In the next matchup, we have the Saints taking on the Colts, and pretty much just going to be fading this QB room. Not interested in Derek Carr, and then also not interested in Gardner Minshew here. We're going to have a divisional matchup between the Patriots and the Dolphins. For the Patriots, going to be sitting Mac Jones here. I think that's pretty obvious, just not enough consistent production there out of him or that offense. And then for the Dolphins, I'm going to start Tua. He hasn't exactly, stayed as hot as he started off the season, but this is a fine matchup here going against the Patriots. Nothing overly scary. I think it's a much easier matchup than what he had against the Eagles. So I think he's a solid start option. Hopefully Waddle's healthy, good to go. They'll have the run game going a little bit to kind of balance that offense out. So I do like Tua as a start this week as like a mid-tier QB1 play. Then we're going to have the Jets facing off against the Giants. Not a pretty quarterback matchup here. Obviously, you're going to be sitting Zach Wilson. And then for the Giants here, Daniel Jones could make his return. Even if Jones is playing, definitely sitting him. Jets defense has been tough. They have made much better quarterbacks look very, very human. And then same thing with Tyrod Taylor. If he's playing, he is definitely going to be a sit for me. In the next game, we have the Jaguars taking on the Steelers. I mentioned how Matthew Stafford hadn't been able to rack up those passing touchdowns. Trevor Lawrence has been in a similar boat here. Like, his passing numbers have been solid. From a real-life perspective, he's playing at a pretty high level. The passing touchdowns and, like, rushing touchdowns just haven't been there for him. They should come. I think at this point he's like a fringe option, back-end QB1, but still someone you feel pretty decent playing. And then for the Steelers, going to be sitting Kenny Pickett. Just not someone I want to be playing in your typical like 12-ish team leagues. In the next game, we have the Falcons taking on the Titans. Very gross QB matchup here. Definitely going to be sitting Desmond Ridder. And then it doesn't seem like Ryan Tannehill is going to be healthy for this game. And not only are we just going to get one of these dudes, Vrabel came out and said that he thinks they're going to use both quarterbacks if Tannehill can't play. So I don't know what that's going to look like. What it tells me is that we want to stay as far away from this quarterback room as possible for fantasy football purposes. Next up is going to be a divisional matchup here between the Eagles and the Commanders. For the Eagles, you fire up Jalen Hurts as a high-end QB1. And then for the Commanders, I feel like Sam Howell has kind of established himself as a weekly fringe option. Tough matchup here against the Eagles, but he actually fared pretty well the first time they played a few weeks ago. So I think he's probably like a high-end QB2 this week. You may not love it. With no teams on bye, you may have a better option, but if you're struggling at the quarterback position, there's been some injuries, Rodgers, Richardson, whoever you had originally, I think he's a fine option if you want to roll with him. Next up is going to be the Browns taking on the Seahawks. The Deshaun Watson injury situation continues to drag on. We don't know if he's going to play in this game. If he does play, I think he's a fringe option as like a higher end QB2. If he doesn't play, you just punt the the backup there with PJ Walker. And then for the Seahawks, I actually have Geno Smith here as a sit, and I kind of like Geno heading into the season. He played so well last year as a fantasy option. His weapons only improved, bringing in Zach Charbonnet, bringing in JSN, and his fantasy production has just not been there. The passing touchdowns haven't been there. The passing volume hasn't been there. And now he draws a really tough matchup here against the Browns. Like, he wasn't able to put up decent numbers against the Cardinals. Tough for me to then buy into him here going up against this Browns defense. So, unfortunately, he is going to be a sit for me here. Next up is going to be the Ravens taking on the Cardinals. For the Ravens, you fire up Lamar Jackson coming off a huge passing day. You love to see it, high-end QB1. And then for the Cardinals, going to be sitting Joshua Dobbs. I think in certain matchups, he could be fringe-worthy. This is just not one of them. Ravens have a tough defense. Would not want to be relying on Dobbs here in my fantasy lineup. In a divisional matchup between the Chiefs and the Broncos, obviously you're firing up Patrick Mahomes as a solid QB1. And then for the Broncos, I have Russ as a sit. I could see the argument for the fringe option. The last 2 weeks have been really, really rough. Just really not a player I want to be counting on in my fantasy lineup. And one of those rough games was against the Chiefs a couple of weeks ago. So not feeling great about Russ. Then in probably one of the better matchups of the week, Bengals taking on the 49ers. I have both of these quarterbacks listed as fringe plays. For Joe Burrow, obviously he's coming off the bye week. Draws a tough matchup here against the 49ers. Even though Kirk played well, still think this 49ers defense is very, very impressive. I think there are still questions on what Joe Burrow is going to look like. Like, is he going to look completely back to 100% with that bye week? Is he still going to be somewhat limited? We have to wait and see. So for that reason, he will be a fringe option. And then for Brock Purdy, I feel like he's kind of teetering the edge between a fringe option and a start. Obviously, his weapons are great. Bengals defense isn't like a smash matchup, so I think he's more of like a back-end QB1 this week, but someone I still think you could have some confidence firing up. Then Sunday Night Football, we have the Bears taking on the Chargers. For the Bears here with Tyler Bagent, seems like Justin Fields doubtful for this one. I think with Bagent, he did a good job kind of being a game manager last week. I don't think he's someone you're going to want to go out and like plug and play into your fantasy lineups. For the Chargers, Justin Herbert, not great. As of late, started off really hot, hasn't necessarily continued it, but decent matchup here against the Bears. I think he could get right here on Sunday Night Football. And then in the final game of the week here, we have the Raiders taking on the Lions. For the Raiders, it does seem like they're going to be getting Jimmy G back for this one. Good to see for the rest of the weapons in terms of Jimmy G as a fantasy quarterback. Definitely would prefer to sit him here. And then for Jared Goff, I went back and forth between a start and a fringe option. I ended up settling with a start. I think you could make the argument for fringe. He's been very impressive this season, coming off a down game against the Ravens, just kind of one of those games that snowballed on him. So I don't think he's like totally cooked. I think he'll be very solid moving forward. Raiders have been kind of average in terms of fantasy points given up to the quarterback position, so not a great matchup, not a terrible matchup. I think Goff will be solid as like a mid to back end QB1, and that is going to wrap it up for every single Week 8 matchup. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, hit that like button, subscribe if you are not already subscribed. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.